purpose of the Flick-Reedy Education Enterprises is to promote individual moral responsibility through education. How do we do this? We study and discuss the interrelationships of history, philosophy, social studies, and economics. We do not dictate. We do not make statements as to what we think you should or should not do. We do not unduly burden this program with footnotes, references, or complete documentation. However, we do give sufficient data to bring this discussion into proper focus. We invite you to delve further into the necessary historical and statistical data to develop a deeper understanding of truth and a keener sense of individual moral responsibility.
For the greater part of the war, the Continental Congress had directed the war effort without any formalized constitution or written document. A document had been proposed as early as 1776, but never ratified. The stumbling block to ratification had been the claiming of the western lands by several states. Finally, all the states concerned agreed to give the western lands to the United States. By these cessions, the United States acquired a large national domain whose sale could be applied to the Revolutionary War debt and on which new states could be formed. The first document to tie together the 13 states was ratified on March 1st, 1781. This document was called the Articles of Confederation. The 13 colonies were, by this document, drawn into a loose union. It's understandable that after fighting a long and difficult war to gain their independence, the 13 colonies would be extremely careful not to give too much power to any centralized government, lest it perpetuate upon them the same evils against which they had just fought, lest it deprive them of liberty and freedom that they had just won. The Articles of Confederation, for example, gave the Continental Congress no power to regulate commerce. As a result, there was a hodgepodge of trade and tariff barriers between the several states. Even more frustrating was the inability of Congress to obtain tax money from the citizens. The tax method used was called the requisition method. It consisted of assessing the value of all the land, buildings, and so forth of all the 13 colonies, and from that, determining each state's percentage proportion of that total. Suppose that the Continental Congress decided that it needed $100,000. Let us further suppose that New York State's evaluation percentage was 25%. In effect, then, Congress would say to the delegates of New York State, "Would you go back home and please raise $25,000 from your citizens and send it to us? For as you know, we have no power to extract tax money from the citizen of any state directly." If a state wasn't in sympathy with the purpose of the $100,000, its delegates could drag their feet by not collecting or forwarding the money. The Continental Congress could do nothing about it. You can see the problems this caused, particularly when they were fighting a war of survival. While the Articles of Confederation provided for a legislative body, the Continental Congress, it did not provide for either an executive or judicial branch of government at the federal level. The Articles proved to be too weak. It was to amend and or rewrite the Articles that a convention was called to meet at Annapolis, Maryland in September 1786. Only 5 states responded. Alexander Hamilton suggested that another convention be called, to be held in Philadelphia in May 1787. And this is what most of us recall as the Constitutional Convention. By this time, it was generally agreed that the effort would be to draft a new constitution rather than amend the earlier Articles of Confederation. It took 12 days after the convention date before even a quorum from 7 of the 13 states was assembled. Other state representatives straggled in. Rhode Island refused to send delegates to any convention which was to consider giving a central government increased powers. Of the 55 delegates from 12 states assembled, 39 had been members of the Continental Congress. As in any kind of convention, the first order of business was to elect a chairman, or president. George Washington was unanimously elected without opposition, no doubt the result of the stature he had attained as general of the armies in the War of Independence. The convention was to meet in the old State House, now called Independence Hall, the same hall where the Declaration of Independence was signed, and from which the Liberty Bell had proclaimed liberty throughout the land. In appreciation of the delegates to the convention and to the task on which they were to labor, the city fathers of Philadelphia sprinkled dirt and sawdust over the cobblestones in front of Independence Hall, so that the noise of carriages would not disturb the deliberations. One of the most interesting rules adopted by the convention was that it would be secret, that no word of the exact nature of their deliberations would be made known to the general public until they were all finished. Washington's caution on this point is interesting. He cautioned against letting any transactions get into the newspapers and disturb the public repose by premature speculations. They didn't want to be set upon by special interest groups clamoring for this and that. Another rule adopted is interesting because of the contrast with the general conduct in our National Congress and state legislatures. That rule, reflecting the dignity of this assembly, is as follows. Every member rising to speak shall address the President, and while he shall be speaking, none shall pass between them or hold discourse with another, or read a book, pamphlet, or paper, printed or manuscript. In addition to the issue of slavery, there were two basic issues confronting the convention. The first was the numerical representation from the various states, which would make up the legislative branch of the federal government. There were the small states, fearing the power of the large states who would pay the bulk of the taxes, not wanting to be bound by equal votes of the small states. We take it for granted that the solution, consisting of one house of the legislature based on population and the other, the Senate, with equal representation from each state regardless of population or area, was easy. We must remember that such a solution was new to history and was the result of some 13 different proposals by the convention delegates. But it was during the convention and extending through the ratification that was to follow that the most difficult problem had to be worked out. The state of Rhode Island had already pointed up the problem by its refusal to send delegates. How much more power should properly be given to the federal government? It was this concern, even fear, that ran through the convention from May to September in 1787. It was generally acknowledged that the authority and responsibility contained in the Articles of Confederation was too little. But how much further shall the convention go in giving power to the federal government? Since the delegates considered the legislative branch of the new government to be the most important and operational, their months of discussion and their ideas are concluded chiefly in Article 1, Section 8, the powers of the Congress. This is perhaps the most important section of the whole Constitution, and it's worth taking the time to examine in its entirety. Section 8 is composed of one and only one sentence. This fact is important to its meaning. We will examine its meaning further in the next part of Two Worlds. Article 1, Section 8 begins with a broad general phrase.
The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States.
Here, the convention delegates thought to put in a restricting phrase. This was to prevent, among other things, a different import tax schedule in the New York harbor than that of Charleston or Boston and so forth. Did you notice the punctuation mark after the last words quoted? It was a semicolon. Now to continue with the specific items the delegates next listed.
To borrow money on the credit of the United States. To regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes.
Here was a power not held under the Articles of Confederation, now included in the new Constitution.
To establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. To coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and to fix the standard of weights and measures.
This is an interesting point as it refers to their own immediate past history during the War for Independence. The Continental Congress had had vexing money problems, in that while it had the power to lay taxes, it had no power to collect them from the sovereign states or their people. As all governments in history have done when they did not have as much money as they thought they needed, they resorted to inflation. But to an annoying degree, the colonists refused to accept this printing press paper money at its face value. And out of this circumstance came the phrase, "not worth a continental," meaning the money had no real value. Continuing with Article 1, Section 8.
To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. To establish post offices and post roads. To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries.
You and I would think immediately of the U.S. Patent Office as the outgrowth of this part.
To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court.
At this point, we should notice that the 8 foregoing specific items have to do with the general welfare, in that the benefits conferred by these powers of Congress would benefit all the people of the United States, everywhere and at the same time, devoid of any special interest or favor, literally, the general welfare. Now, as we continue, note how the next group have to do with common defense.
To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the law of nations. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. To raise and support armies.
Here again, the convention delegates knew from history that armies sometimes got out of hand and took over the government. So they reasoned our best bet was to keep the army in short supply of money as a deterrent to their capability to take over. And accordingly, they added to the foregoing power.
But no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. To provide and maintain a navy.
It's not known whether they had more confidence in the Navy than they did in the Army, but the record shows that they put no limit on appropriations for the Navy.
To make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. To provide for calling forth the militia, to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions.
There are several points of interest in these last two parts. First, the colonists were extremely dubious about a federal standing army and wanted to count on the federal government's use of the various state militias for the bulk of our land forces. Secondly, note how they limited the use to which the federal government could employ the militia.
To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress.
Did you note how carefully the checks and balances between the sovereign states and the federal government are woven into that part? I think you'll recognize how these last several parts dealt with the common defense of the country. Rather specific, weren't they? Now comes an important part describing in detail all the land they wanted the federal government to own and control. Listen carefully.
To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States.
This you and I know as Washington, D.C., obtained in part from Virginia and Maryland. Now, what other land may the federal government have?
And to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings.
It appears that it was the intent of the convention delegates that the federal government was to own and control no more land than Washington, D.C., and such other places as the requirements for military bases. Yet today, after all the western territories have been converted into states, we find the federal government owning or controlling land equal to approximately 1/3 of the land area of the present 50 states. How come? What is the authority for it? Why does not all the land within a state boundary automatically belong to that state or its citizens, except for military bases as described so clearly in the Constitution?
And to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof.
This is the part which enables the Congress to make further laws to implement the specific intent of those powers specifically mentioned. Suffice to say that from the close of the convention to this day, not one amendment has pertained to this Article 1, Section 8. It has remained exactly the same in writing as it was the day the convention closed. We should definitely know that the above Article 1, Section 8 is one long sentence separated into parts by semicolons. This has a significance which we will examine in the next part of Two Worlds. How much power did the convention believe they had given to the Congress? What reasons do we have for thinking so? We will discuss these questions at a later time. On September 17th, 1787, the Constitutional Convention met for the last time. Only 42 of the original 55 remained in attendance. Only 39 actually signed the document. Several refused to sign. The convention ended in an atmosphere of gloom. Many believed they had failed and that no permanent value would result from their efforts. Nevertheless, there began the task of obtaining ratification. How difficult would it be to convince the people who had just thrown off a tyrannical government to willingly accept a stronger central government?